We'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you all so much for joining us. It is really lovely to see some of your faces. I really miss all of you, and I wish that we could do an event like this in person, but hopefully soon enough we'll be able to make that happen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emma Kahn, and I coordinate our detention services here at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. I'm also a legal assistant, and I work alongside the wonderful Carlos Rodriguez. I don't know if you all can see our little person squares, but he's in here. And I work under the fabulous supervising attorney, Arifa Raza, who's here as well, and our executive director, Adriela Roscoe, who is also here. And I believe Abdiel is also on video right now. He has helped us design tonight's presentation. And I always joke about how like there are all these Zooms now that start with housekeeping, and now I'm going to start a big Zoom meeting with housekeeping. There is a chat box, which I hope you all can see. Feel free to put any questions in there, Q&A at the end as well. Carlos will be moderating that chat box and responding to as many questions as he can as we go. You'll notice that you're all muted. You do have the ability, you should have the ability to unmute yourselves. Please like chat me if that's not the case, but please go ahead and stay muted just until the Q&A so we can make sure the sound doesn't like reverberate. You're welcome to keep your video on or turn it off. Any faces I think are really lovely to see, especially right now. So yeah, feel free to chat us if you have any questions. And again, this recording will be sent out to everyone along with that new listserv. So many of you know that this year we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary at NMILC. We were supposed to have a big party, and we will do that eventually. It might be our 11th year at that point, but we will do it. So here at NMILC, our mission is to advance justice and equity by empowering low-income and immigrant communities through collaborative legal services, advocacy, and education. So this here is what we refer to as our pipeline. We focus on policy, education, and advocacy, and direct services and leadership development, all for the purposes of working toward a vibrant New Mexico where all people, regardless of immigration status, can achieve their full potential and are treated with dignity and respect. This sort of structures our entire sort of internal operations and the services that we offer to our community. And we encourage you all to visit our website for more information about this. And I also want to plug really quickly on our website, we have just added a bunch of bilingual COVID-19 resources that are immigrant friendly. They are officially vetted by our team. So many of you also know, who have been with us for a while, that we have been running consistent detention programming since the spring of 2017. And NMILC was actually founded in part through programming related to immigrants' rights work in the, I believe it was the Metro detention holding centers here in Albuquerque, but we've been running sort of more formalized detention programming for about 3 years now. And all of that started at the Cibola County Correctional Center, which is located in Milan, New Mexico. Always love to shout out Spicy Bite for keeping us going for all these 3 years. We miss them as well. And we have never had a formal contract for our services out at Cibola. We have just always run them sort of out of our own pockets at NMILC. And we have expanded our detention programming almost for a year now to the Torrance County Detention Facility, which opened in August of last year. And that is located in Estancia, New Mexico. And we did previously have a contract on and off from September through May for services out there, and then they cut back because the numbers were lower. And with both of those facilities, we were running programming in person between 1 and 3 days per week, depending on what the population size looked like. And of course, many of you know that there is a third immigrant prison here in New Mexico, down in Chaparral, New Mexico. That's the Otero County Processing Facility. We do not do any consistent programming out there just because it's too far away, but we do occasionally take clients out of Otero And we work with our partners at the El Paso Immigration Collaborative to streamline referrals and make sure that folks get access to the programming that is offered down there. So since the pandemic hit in March, in the middle of March, we stopped going out to Cibola and Torrance in person, and we switched all of our programming to be run remotely. This happens 1 day per week in each facility, Tuesdays in Torrance and Thursdays at Cibola. The Cibola numbers are really, really low, so we have not had a lot of callers, but it is, we think there are maybe like at most a couple dozen guys there. At Torrance, the numbers are still much lower than what they could be, what they have capacity to house. We think that there is anywhere from 100 to 200 men there, like these days, although of course, as many of you know, it changes all the time. In terms of case posturing, I know a lot of you have been asking me about this. Cibola is like really, from what I can tell, just long-term holds. There are guys in there who I met in October who are still stuck there, either waiting out appeals or waiting out OSEP, like the OSEP timeline, or just deportations because home countries won't take them, especially in the pandemic. I think it's possible that there are some occasional new transfers, and we've been trying our best to try to get the facility to like send those folks to us, but I have not gotten those calls recently, and so I don't think that there are very many like expedited removal folks. In Torrance, it has remained primarily expedited removal, and I know a lot of you probably saw a headline this morning about expedited removal. We're trying to figure out what that means too. We haven't quite figured that out yet, but we are like mostly people are in Torrance for the CFI and RFI, which is that first stage of the asylum process, as a lot of you know, or they have just had their interviews and they are waiting to be transferred. There is talk of VTC, which is the video hearing technology, like ramping up. We have heard from a few guys that they have had VTC hearings, like master calendar hearings. But from what we can tell, there isn't really an organized system for like X number of people, or like X kinds of people get X kinds of hearings within X like number of days. It seems pretty random. So yeah, it's a lot of guys in expedited removal, and we have seen really, I would say, especially in the last couple of months, just insanely high numbers of CFI denials. And you know, we really believe that a lot of these claims are either legitimate or at least should not be denied at that stage. And so we are trying to really track this as best as we can to get a sense of what, how we can sort of intervene if possible, particularly if the federal courts are no longer allowed to hear any appeals for the CFI. We have been, the way we've been doing our remote programming is mostly through the phone. Carlos actually created a really, really awesome CFI preparation video that all of the guys at Torrance watch before they talk to us on the phone. And then we do individual consultations. We've been able to do those phone consults with over 200 men since going remote in the middle of March. And that is honestly a lot lower than we could have done, but we think the numbers are lower, and we think that folks are not, we know that some folks have been turned away from our program. So we are available to talk to anybody who wants to do that. And we are hoping that as many people as possible actually are aware of that, are made aware of that. And then we mail them in any guides or forms that we think are really important to share. And I can also help people like fill out the forms over the phone and then mail them in. So that has actually been a sort of a pretty decent workaround to the issue of not being able to go out there in person. So I hope you all have had a chance to look at the Freedom for Immigrants website. This is like where I am turning to truly every day for just like the most critical of information. I used to talk all the time about how the TRAC data out of Syracuse University is my saving grace. This is my new saving grace, and I will like turn it into my soapbox forever. But they have launched I want to say it was like maybe a year ago, maybe someone can correct me, an interactive immigration detention map. And so what they were already mapping was any like litigation that was pending, any issues that facilities were having, general stats, demographics, information about like facility operation. And then since March, or maybe the beginning of April, they have been reporting specifically on COVID issues. They have set up a hotline in, I'm pretty sure, most detention centers across the country, where folks can call in from jail and report issues, like any kind of COVID related issue. And advocates can also call in or fill out a Google form, like a survey that has been circulated through a lot of national advocacy networks. To give you a sense of how powerful this hotline is, first of all, Freedom for Immigrants are the folks behind the original hotline a few years ago that was shut down after Orange is the New Black promoted it or like referenced it in their show. So ICE has a history of sort of retaliating against FFI for these hotlines. But particularly in the last couple of weeks, ICE has shut, Core Civic at the direction of ICE has shut down the FFI COVID hotline in a couple of detention centers in California and in New York. And so we'll talk a little bit more about ICE retaliation a bit later, but it just like this feels really important to me to frame how powerful this hotline is. And in general, the like sources of our information on a daily basis are coming from FFI and actually from the ICE website, which is actually like it's pretty delayed most of the time and has its reporting issues, but they are putting a significant amount of data out there. So I checked the numbers this morning, and the detained population across the country was 23,429 ICE like immigrants. This is about half of what it was this time last year. We were seeing numbers in the mid 50,000 range. And this is likely due to decreased ICE enforcement operations across the country. But it's still 23,429 people who really don't need to be in jail. And of those, there were 899, actually, I think that got updated later this afternoon, but almost 900 COVID positive cases. And that's just like the current ones that they're monitoring. In total, there have been almost 2,500 confirmed COVID cases in ICE detention. And this has, over the past, I think like 3 or 4 weeks, it's been increasing at a 300 detainee per week average. There have been ICE is reporting 2 COVID deaths among detainees in custody since the pandemic hit, but their advocates are sort of making arguments about why that number is misleading. And they have reported 0 employee deaths, but employees of ICE detention centers across the country have been themselves reporting more deaths. They've been reporting, I've seen like upwards of 10. ICE will not confirm these deaths. ICE is also refusing to publicly release the numbers of COVID positive cases among third-party contractors. So a lot of you who have been out to these centers know, like, you have Core Civic who handles the operation of the facility, but then they have their own catering company, and then they have their own private like health company. And the ICE will not release numbers of COVID cases for those folks. Here in New Mexico, as of today, there were 143 total, so not currently under monitoring, but total COVID cases in Otero, 37 in Torrance, 0 in Cibola, although there are cases in the Marshall units, the non-immigration units, and 0 deaths so far. We also have seen 119 cases in the El Paso Processing Center, which is just across the border and is part of the same network of detention centers as Torrance, Cibola, and Otero. Some of you may have seen from FFI's reporting that Torrance actually got its first positive COVID case from a detainee who was transferred while he was COVID positive, he had been confirmed COVID positive in the El Paso processing center and transferred up to Torrance while still positive a few days later into Torrance, and that is how it got up here. And so FFI really has been critical for capturing these like big pattern issues. And I'm going to name a few of them right now, and I would really encourage you to read their reports if you can stomach them. And we'll get into some like pretty horrific specifics a little bit later on, and I'll give like a little content warning. But some of the general patterns that FFI has been reporting on and that we have seen on a smaller scale here in New Mexico is these really insane, or includes these really insane transfers. So there have been not only just really senseless transfers of COVID positive detainees between centers here in the El Paso, New Mexico area and all across the country, but they've even been these what's called circular transfers where people end up where they started. So like somebody will leave Torrance, they will go to Louisiana for no reason. They will go to Miami for no reason. They will go back to El Paso for no reason, and then they'll end up back in Torrance for no reason. And in that time, if they're not COVID positive, they are being exposed to God knows how many potential carriers. That's been one of the biggest issues so far. FFI has been also really closely watching the use of chemical disinfectants. So we have heard stories from folks about really, really severe physical, like bodily reactions to the bleach and similar chemicals that are being used to protect and like sanitize the units. And FFI actually filed a lawsuit along with the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice against the use, or to inquire about the use of these chemical disinfectants. And they were reporting that people were having allergic reactions that were actually like making them more vulnerable to COVID. And that the chemicals were, if you looked at the labels, like they were not meant for close human contact. And so that has been a big issue that FFI has been trying to bring attention to. They've also been talking a lot about inconsistent testing. So in Torrance, actually this week, they allegedly tested every single detainee, although that means nothing to me because they're still having transfers, like people in and out every week. But a lot of detention centers have been either we have some of our friends in Minnesota did a webinar a couple days ago, and like they have had 0 tests, and so they've had 0 cases, but they believe that a lot of the detainees are COVID positive. FFI has been talking a lot about centers that are were for a couple of weeks getting a lot of tests from their states delivered to them, and then just like fully stopped testing altogether. And it's hard to determine exactly like what players are involved in of course, for all of us, like the abundance of COVID tests. But FFI is watching this really closely in ICE detention. They've also been reporting a lot on inconsistent quarantining, or what ICE calls cohorting. This was like back in the days when measles was our biggest problem. We used to like laugh at the cohort idea because it is such a ridiculous way of saying quarantine, but that's the term that ICE has required their employees to use. We have heard stories of people whose 14-day quarantines are spread out throughout different units at best, different detention centers at worst. So like people are doing 3 days of a quarantine in Torrance, and then 5 days of a quarantine in El Paso, and then 6 days of a quarantine in Otero. And that is of course not a quarantine. And we have heard from guys who said like, oh yeah, when I got transferred up here, I was in cohort for 3 days, and now I'm back with all the other guys. And so FFI has been really on top of this inconsistent cohorting issue. Just gonna find, there's one piece of litigation that, or a statement from Vera in addition to litigation that FFI recently reported on in their latest report last week. And I just wanted to read a little bit of that. They said that on June 4th, the Vera Institute of Justice released the preliminary results of a prevalence model, which suggests that COVID-19 is spreading through ICE detention at a much higher rate than the agency reports. Not surprising, this is actually consistent with like models not in ICE detention as well. Vera estimates that the true number of people who contracted COVID-19 in ICE detention may be 15 times higher than officially reported numbers as of mid-May. And so I've heard similar projections of like the non-detention world, but with sort of a 10 times higher estimate. And I think the like 15, potentially 20 times higher estimate for ICE detention is really relevant because we know that social distancing is not possible. And we know that folks are sharing surfaces, they are sharing clothes that are not even properly washed. There are stories of people's mattresses not being like cleaned or changed after they test positive for COVID and are transferred out. It's just like a lot of really intense sharing. And those really dangerous chemicals that they're using on the walls don't really seem to be doing a whole lot. I also wanted to mention something that FFI reported a week ago, which was that at least 3 CoreCivic employees, CoreCivic is the private prison company that runs the Torrance and Cibola detention centers that we work at, and many ICE detention centers and prisons across the country. At least 3 CoreCivic employees at the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego, which has been one of the highest concentrations of COVID since the pandemic hit. They have sued CoreCivic, their own company, for failure to implement proper public health protocols during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing a lot of CoreCivic whistleblowers, which is really nice, particularly around COVID-19 deaths among CoreCivic and ICE employees, because ICE is, again, not releasing those numbers. And some of the conclusions that FFI has drawn is that ICE is just not willing to protect the people who are, forget the most vulnerable, or like just the general population, but especially the most vulnerable folks. And this includes like kids and older detainees. They have, there's a little button on their website where you can see how many people the judges have ordered released since the pandemic hit. And this number is like humiliatingly low for them. And it doesn't even account for, it doesn't say anything about how many people have requested release or what the bases of those requests are. And we have our own stories of ICE not responding to requests for release. But they're unwilling to sort of do the right thing there, which is not surprising. They're also putting out there some numbers that a lot of advocates see as really misleading, or just excluding numbers altogether. And the practices of cohorting and testing that they're doing are really inconsistent with what they're saying they're doing. And that is not surprising. Again, we know that they frequently put information out there or sort of statements that do not reflect the actual practices. And even the statements are relatively weak. And that they are continuing to retaliate really viciously against not only just like the sort of frustration and people requesting release, but also the sort of peaceful organizing. And again, we'll share a little bit about that in a minute. But this retaliation, from what we've seen through FFI and through our own programming, has taken the form of solitary confinement, which we know has been a use, like a frequent CoreCivic and ICE tool weapon of punishment for a very long time. They've cut the hotline, they've cut phone calls to legal representatives and family and friends in some detention centers. They have cut rec time outside. They have cut meal time. They have cut a lot of these really basic like parts of structured time in detention. And so FFI has been really great with that reporting. There's also a similar map that was created out of some Harvard group of students called Detained in Danger, the COVID-19 Pandemic Inside ICE Facilities. I will send all of these links out, but it's sort of a live tracker as well. And then I wanted to quickly talk about the Freyhat versus ICE litigation that was certified with its class membership in April. So back in August of last year, the Southern Poverty Law Center and a handful of other partners, they filed a nationwide class action lawsuit to essentially try to ensure that ICE is giving people the proper medical and mental health care that they need, particularly for folks with disabilities in ICE detention. And in April, so they filed this lawsuit before the pandemic hit, obviously, and it was sort of coincidentally certified in April. And what this lawsuit essentially mandates is that ICE consider for release, and I think like consider favorably for release, anybody who is considered to be one of their subclass members, which is like at a particular risk for COVID or for any other serious health issues. So this includes pregnant women, anybody over the age of 55, and anybody with a chronic health condition. And Arifa is going to talk a little bit more about these requests later on, but this has been really helpful to us because it is sort of, SPLC has put out some really, really strong templates and examples for how to present these claims. And it really happened at a time when ICE detainees were particularly vulnerable and about to be sort of restricted even further from their release options. So, okay, yes, that is most of the Frey Hat information. And Arifa, do you want to talk a little bit more about release and our programming?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Emma, for that great overview. So, hi everyone, my name is Arifa and I'm the supervising attorney for our detention programming. So since COVID became a threat to the state, the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center has implemented a program designed to help to get as many medically vulnerable people out of detention. So what we started doing was in April, we began screening all people that came through our legal orientation programs in Cibola and in Torrance. And we're screening them for any medical condition or medical vulnerability. If they mentioned a condition, then we conduct a humanitarian parole screening and a Frey Hat screening. So humanitarian parole authorizes ICE to release an individual who's in their custody if they meet certain requirements, such as not being a flight risk or a security risk. And they have to have a serious medical condition that makes their detention inappropriate. And as Emma Kahn mentioned, under the Frey Hat injunction, ICE is to identify and consider releasing individuals with specific medical conditions that make them vulnerable to COVID. And most of those types of conditions are upper respiratory issues, heart conditions, cancer, and other types of chronic medical conditions. So the reason we do both these types of screenings for the individuals that we see is because depending on where a person is in their immigration process, they may not qualify for humanitarian parole. But if they're a class member in the Frey Hat suit, then they can still try to apply for release under Frey Hat. So the main example that I can think of are the individuals that we see in Cibola. A lot of them are already with removal orders and they're waiting for their deportation. So for those folks, they may still be allowed to be released out of detention under the Frey Hat lawsuit if they're a class member. And as of April, we've screened about 200 individuals in Torrance and Cibola and have done 40 in-depth or follow-up screenings. And then from there, we provided various levels of support. So we either take a case for direct representation, which means it gets staffed with an attorney from NMILC who will represent them in the request for custody release. Or if we can't represent them, then we give them pro se materials to help them seek release from ICE on their own. We also help them get medical records and we advocate for medical treatment directly with the facilities. As of right now, we've taken 12 cases for direct rep, but we're prepared to represent many more individuals who are in active immigration proceedings and who have serious medical conditions. So the cases that we take are challenging for various reasons, including the regular challenges that come with working with someone who's detained and trying to just gather documents, make those phone calls. So all the regular challenges, but the main challenge is ICE's refusal to, look at the requests we're filing or to follow the Frey Hat injunction. So it takes a lot of follow-up from us and a lot of advocacy to get any traction with ICE. So when we take a case, what does it mean? It means that we're putting together the strongest release packet possible. So whether it be for parole or for a Freiheit release. And they're both nearly identical. Actually, they are identical in how we prepare it. So we try to include as much evidence of their medical condition. And to do so, we've worked with our volunteer doctors who conduct medical and psychological evaluations for our clients. And those help to support the fact that they are medically vulnerable to COVID-19 and that they should be released. We also work with clients' families to get medical documentation from their home country and any other supporting documents that could help their case. And then we also rely on volunteer translators. And I think a few of you might be here with us today. So we really rely on you all to help translate documents that we receive into English. And so far, we've only gotten 1 out of our 12 clients released, which, you know, is a great success because we were able to get 1 person out, but it shows the challenges that and all the difficulties in getting folks released. We'll continue working with detained individuals to advocate for their release and try to keep the government accountable. And so we're doing that by filing complaints. Now we're trying to build up capacity so that we can start suing ICE for their indifference to the laws and for their just negligence. We'll also keep you all informed or keep the community informed of what's going on within the detention centers that we work in so that we can all work together and advocate for detained immigrants. I did want to ask Adriel, our executive director, to share his experience working with his client because he was the only one who has successfully gotten a client release from immigrant detention. So I thought, you know, you can hear about all of my horrible challenges, but this one can end with a good note. So if Adriel, if you can just share some of the challenges you faced working with your client and the reactions you were getting from ICE and from the immigration judges.
Hi everyone, my name is Adriel Orozco. I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center and also an attorney on staff. And thanks to Rifa. So I think that the story of my client is actually a story of the compounding complexities under this administration and trying to represent somebody, and then how COVID-19 even exacerbated that. So my client had actually been detained by ICE in February of this year when ICE actually did a really large, I think the largest enforcement action that we have seen in Albuquerque, where at least 30 individuals were arrested in a series of 4 days. And I thought I saw Fabiola from El Centro on this call, and they're an advocacy group, but immigrant rights and worker rights group that we've been working with to try to address immigration enforcement in our communities. So my client was in his early 20s, and he has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And his family was fearful because they were unable to locate him. And so starting in 2017, when Trump came into office, ICE stopped providing what are called administrative bonds, which means that ICE no longer here in Albuquerque would try to give somebody a bond before sending them to a detention center. And they categorically just stopped and started just sending people down to the El Paso area. My client, we eventually found out that he had been sent to a mental health hospital in the El Paso area, still under ICE arrest. After about a month, he was released into a detention center in El Paso Processing Center, where I was finally able to make contact with him. We submitted a bond request with an immigration judge, but that took some time to get. So I also submitted a request with ICE to have him released. He had been living here since 6 years old. He was unable to apply for DACA at the moment because DACA had been rescinded before, of course, the DACA, the Supreme Court decision last week. And so he was denied by ICE and told, and we were told that we simply just had to go before an immigration judge. and in the past, I've been told by ICE officers that it's a mere inconvenience for individuals to have to go before an immigration judge. But the difficulty is that once a person is now 3 or 4 hours away, they have to pay for calls out of the facility. If they're able to get a free call, sometimes those calls are time limited. And so, and of course, my client has schizophrenia and had a lot of difficulty functioning independently and couldn't figure out how to use the phone. So he was unable to make calls out to me, so had to rely on ICE to set up those calls. After ICE denied my bond, we went before an immigration judge who determined that my client was not a danger to the community, which is generally the reason why ICE categorically denies everybody an administrative bond, because they think that they're a danger to the community, and even folks with low-level crimes, misdemeanors, or even dismissed charges, cases that are closed and dismissed in the criminal justice system, they use those to arrest individuals and call them dangers to the community. The judge determined that he wasn't a danger to the community, but he was a flight risk. And so this was right in the middle of the pandemic starting to expand. The El Paso Processing Center just started with a few cases, confirmed cases there. So then after FREHAT, I was able to get 2 pro bono psychiatrists to be able to support my renewed application to make an argument that my client was at particular risk because of his schizophrenia and his inability to function independently, that if he did get COVID-19, he was unable to manage it. And so ICE was eventually amenable to that argument and did allow my client released. But that took a series of 3 months and a lot of resources to try to get one individual out. And of course, FREHAT, the lawsuit is only important, or its function is to get ICE to re-review these cases with individuals with particular what are called risk factors. But that at the end of the day, we know that any human being who's behind those bars is subject to getting COVID-19. And we know that it's unclear exactly who are going to have the most serious side effects from COVID-19. And so it's unfortunate that it took so many resources to get one individual, but definitely our call is to have every single immigrant released from detention, because we know that ICE's history of abusive and neglectful practices will not protect them. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Adria. And I know we have Susan Smith from Civic ABQ and Margaret Brown Vega from AVID here. Civic ABQ is part of Freedom for Immigrants, is a chapter. And so I would love if you two would be willing to share a little bit about some of what you've been hearing about Torrance and Otero. Let's see, maybe Susan, if you want to hop on first.
Okay, thanks, Emma. It's really great that you're doing this and sharing this information. So Civic ABQ is a local chapter of Freedom for Immigrants that used to visit people in detention at Cibola and Torrance, writes letters, and tries to advocate for people when we hear about things that they need help with. And on May 15th, Rebecca Merton from FFI, who I believe is on this call, notified us that they had gotten 3 calls to the FFI hotline about a hunger strike that was going on at Torrance over concerns regarding COVID. In the middle of the night before those calls, when the cameras and the phones had been turned off, guards with masks, maybe gas masks, I'm not sure, came in and sprayed the hunger strikers with what we think is pepper spray. Reportedly were hitting some of the men, and the men were told they would lose their phone privileges and be put in solitary if they wouldn't start eating. FFI also was told about other concerns at that time, including people who wanted to be deported and couldn't get deported. A lot of the wanting to was because of fear of COVID. People who weren't getting medicine for a variety of concerns, unsanitary conditions, and a perpetual complaint about bad food, which does seem to be pretty perpetual, but it was definitely complained about again. So I'm the coordinator for Torrance, and I emailed Warden Miller the next day after getting all this information, and we've had a great relationship with him from the start. He's been very supportive of our program. I asked him about these complaints, and I have never, even including through today, ever heard back from him, which is really unusual. And to me, it suggests that he was on orders not to talk to us, but I don't know that. And we also notified Emma and NMILC about what was going on. After continually trying to talk to Warden Miller to gather more information and writing the few people that we still had contact with inside, since a lot of the men we had been visiting were transferred right before COVID hit. Later in May, then, May 23rd, we notified staff for Representative Holland and Senator Heinrich. And since that time, they do regularly visit and follow up, and they appreciated the information. What I had heard from Cynthia Hull in Holland's office is that supposedly the pods are at 60% capacity. Each of the detained people is supposed to have 2 washable face masks. There's hand sanitizer available in each pod. Their temperatures are being taken twice a day. The staff are wearing masks, and supposedly the new transferred in people are being quarantined for 14 days. This is regarding Torrance, what they had heard from the warden. So the last that I have information of from many of our letter writers is that the protests have stopped, that people have calmed down. This was as of about a week ago, and that spirits are better. And that was from a man who did not have COVID in his unit. So that was probably a better picture than some places would give. That's all I've got for now.
That's great, Susan. That's really, really helpful. We really appreciate the updates that you send us as well. And I know, Margaret, are you able to share some of what you've heard?
Sure. And I'll talk specifically about the Otero County Processing Center. So I'm with AVID, Advocate Visitors with Immigrants in Detention. We are also a local chapter of FFI. We are centered in Las Cruces, Nuevo Mexico, and in El Paso, Texas. So we actually support people also in the El Paso Service Processing Center. And I just want to underscore what Emma sort of said earlier about the connections between these facilities. So we actually continue to support a few individuals in Cibola and at Torrance who sort of at some point on their journey in detention were detained at either at Otero or the El Paso Service Processing Center. In fact, some of these individuals were transferred, we believe, in retaliation for peaceful protests during the last year, right? So I think it's important to kind of, I'm grateful for these networks that we're sort of beginning to strengthen, I think, right now, communicating with each other. So Otero, I think right now probably holds the largest number of people in detention in the state of New Mexico based on what I was hearing earlier for the pretty low numbers in Cibola and in Torrance. And actually, I think Otero is an interesting case to think of and where we don't want to see the other detention facilities in this state go. So Otero was the first facility in the state that had a positive case. And this was in early April. It was not initially revealed. It took, I think, efforts of many advocates, I think, in fact, NMILC, to sort of get this information from congressional offices. So since then, what we sort of saw was some really, really negligent behavior in the facility. There was no access to soap, to hand sanitizer. People were not given masks initially. And this is, you know, at the end of March, beginning of April. We really didn't see that change until maybe late April or into May. At one point, Otero had the 4th largest outbreak of all ICE detention facilities in the United States. That has now changed, but we're very concerned that they're not actually testing adequately in the facility. So Otero went from, about a month ago maybe, 93 positive cases, slowly down to 0. So apparently MTC, the private prison company that manages that facility, knows how to flatten the curve and no one else does, right? And so they got to 0. And what we saw happen after that were transfers of more individuals into the facility. And so now what we're seeing right now is a second surge, if you will, of cases. So I think today there are supposedly, they say 37 active cases. We don't believe that. That's underreporting. Total throughout this pandemic, there's been 143 cases. And actually, the Department of Health at the state of New Mexico is reporting 146. So we've seen these discrepancies throughout the pandemic between the reporting numbers. And it's actually been useful that the state has taken a little bit more of a role in trying to get some of these more accurate, we feel, numbers than what ICE is reporting. One thing I want to mention to Otero that we've been focusing on is the company that manages it, MTC, back in March, due to declining numbers of the people that they detained, notified Otero County that they would stop their contract to manage the facility. And they cited specifically the fact that the Trump administration has these policies that basically have shut down asylum, so no one was coming in. And they argued that there were no transfers actually taking place in the facilities, so they could not get enough people into the facility to make it financially viable. And we've publicized the letter, and it's kind of circulating publicly. I think that's important to recognize the profit motive behind this. So in a time of pandemic, that these companies are engaging in such like negligent, risky behavior that impacts not just the people that are in detention, but ultimately the communities around them, that this is all just done to make sure that they can continue to make profits no matter what. And so what we're now monitoring with the Otero County Processing Center is what will happen with this contract. They got to 0 and sort of were able to make the case that they had resolved the problem. And it's really on the heels of that they began to transfer additional people into the facility. They were probably at about 400 people. It has a capacity for over 1,000. Now we think they're around the 600 range. We started to hear about transfers directly from people inside. And we understand that they were aiming to get towards 700. Individuals again, so still not quite at capacity, but certainly more people than they should be detaining. And what we're hearing from people directly in detention, and I should say that the Freedom for Immigrants hotline does not work at Otero. It never has. And so this has been a real challenge. There has also been severe phone access issues at the facility. So the LOP program, the legal orientation program at Otero, is effectively not happening, and it hasn't been that way for months. And so there are severe due process violations that have just been going on for months now at the Otero County Processing Center. My personal phone number is sort of circulating among people in there, and that's why I hear from people inside, and I'm able to connect them with legal service providers when I can. But this is the kind of sort of connection that many people inside sort of have to these outside resources, which is not how it should be. Phone access, not enough food, rolling quarantines, people when they test positive being thrown into solitary confinement for 14 days. I always like to remind people that the United Nations recognizes that 15 days in solitary confinement is torture. Right, so this is what people inside these facilities, not just Otero, but others, are experiencing. People right now are afraid yet again. I'm speaking to people who are now going through this second surge, and maybe the first time around they escaped testing positive, but this time they're deathly afraid of testing positive. They are constantly being exposed to new individuals that are coming into the facility. They're being mixed with people who are symptomatic. And so it's pretty clear that there's really no care at all from the private prison company or for ICE in terms of what happens to these individuals. They are not being cared for at all. And it has been really difficult, I think, to get people to realize just how difficult the situation is for people in detention we've been trying to call attention to this and a number of other groups, including NMILC, to the situation since the beginning of the pandemic, even before we started having positive cases in the state. What we're doing now is we've just sent a letter to the New Mexico governor, to Governor Lujan Grisham, asking her yet again, this is one of many letters that many advocates have sent, that we've sent to her, to please intervene and to sort of exercise her authority to take measures that will ensure that better protections and sort of pressure ICE to release people from detention because they actually don't need to be held at all. What we're seeing, I know I'm kind of going over time, but I just want to mention something. When you have state oversight, things can look very different. People have probably heard about the Otero County Prison Facility. It's right next door to the processing center. Right now, I think as of today, there are 702 positive cases in that facility, right? That coupled with the number that we've seen at the processing center makes 848. So that's more than we have in Doña Ana County, which is where Las Cruces is, which is a major urban center. The state can go into the prison facility, at least for people in state custody, and they can do testing. And that's where we're seeing the highest numbers. That's not happening with people in federal custody in that facility, and that's not happening with people in ICE custody. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing much fewer numbers being reported from those populations. I suspect, and this is frightening, that the numbers are actually much higher among the federal population in the prison and among the people in the ICE facility. There was a Santa Fe, New Mexican article, I think, that said 80% of the people in state custody in the prison facility have tested positive. So we could actually dealing with much, much larger numbers in both facilities, so the outbreak could be even more horrendous than we even fully appreciate. So I guess I'll sort of end there. I think one thing that I would like to encourage people to do is to sort of pay attention to what these private prisons are doing in our state, and to really make the governor know and our legislators know that we do not want to tolerate this anymore. They're putting all of us at risk. And they're permitting, basically, by arguing that they don't have jurisdiction to do anything, they're permitting some really grave human rights violations and civil rights violations to occur in New Mexico. So that's, I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to talk further if we have an opportunity, maybe at the end of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Margaret. And I'm seeing some questions here. So we're going to try to get to those questions at the end. And we're also going to send out Margaret and Avid's really, really wonderful resources and a couple of other specific action items from us at the end. I want to briefly punt it over to Carlos, who is a Jesuit volunteer and a legal assistant with our team, to sort of zoom us out a little bit more.
Great, thank you, Emma. And I just wanted to kind of, set the importance for the intersections of race, given the Black Lives Matter movement and the uprisings that we've seen across the nation. We believe that this work is very tied to the abolition movement and a lot of movements that are calling for defunding the police in particular. And we've seen support both on the inside of detention facilities and on the outside. For example, some protesters out of Phoenix, Arizona, who were undocumented, were actually arrested in connection with the Black Lives Matter protest. And then they were transferred to ICE, and that's from a story from The Intercept. And so we see that all of this is very connected. The police often collaborating with ICE, and ICE, of course, detaining and deporting Black people at a very disproportionate rate. During this time of COVID, we have also come to find out that Black people are also disproportionately impacted due to the heightened risk of exposure to COVID-19 complications because of medical history due to COVID-19. And again, what was mentioned many times, and we cannot stress this enough, there are so many different forms of reporting going on through our government that we don't necessarily trust. And so we often do have to rely on a lot of our own information that we are receiving, as a form of public reporting that ICE isn't necessarily up to par with. Again, I just want to reiterate that we see Black people incarcerated at very disproportionate rates. And it's the same thing in immigrant detention facilities or immigrant jails and prisons. So we really have to address those issues of systemic racism among our detention or immigration system as well. We, of course, at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, see that detention is part of a larger system that, again, collaborates with the police as sort of a cog in the prison industrial complex. And there was some mention of this, but our relationship with law enforcement has always been complicated, since we do sometimes have to work with them. But we often do reflect and think back about how we can make our advocacy efforts more just and more, just more just for the populations that we serve. We believe in a world free of ICE and ICE detention, because we really, as some of you all have mentioned, see no need for immigration detention. We see no need for an enforcement agency like ICE. And I did want to share a couple of organizations that I've been following. The Undocu Black Network has been an incredible source for me. And these three organizations that I've listed here in the PowerPoint, the Black LGBTQIA Migrant Project and the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, they're all really incredible resources that I encourage you all to check out and see how a lot of the larger systemic issues around prison abolition and anti-police movements are kind of growing. And so I definitely encourage you all to donate if you can, and of course read and educate yourselves on the positions that these organizations take on prisons and as it relates again to immigration.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos. I will just shout him out really quickly. He also wrote a really wonderful piece about the DACA decision last week, where he made some of these same connections. So I will link that article out because I love it. And I know we are truly 1 minute away from the end of this webinar, but I want to hang around just for a little bit for some of these questions, and also see if Adriel wanted to add anything about some of the next steps. And again, we will send out the next steps. Just one more quick repeat of this is being recorded, so please don't say anything that you don't want to be on the record. Email me privately. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And I think I can answer some of the questions that have come out regarding our state, our governor, and contracts. And so I think sort of pulling back a little bit on what Margaret said when she referenced the MTC letter. Management Training Corporation is thinking about shutting down this facility, something that all of us would like to see generally, but the reason why they're doing it is that they're not getting enough money. That each one of the individuals in that facility, it's not because they deserve to be in that facility, it's not because of some bigger question about whether they're a danger to the community, it's because they need money. And so if we look back at the history of the 3 immigrant detention centers, this has been something that's true about the instability of having these detention centers as an economic model for our rural communities. In 2016, in July, the federal government under President Obama moved away against having private companies run federal prisons. And so they removed the contract. But in October of that same year, ICE moved in to house immigrant detainees. And that's how that facility has stayed open. And then Torrance in 2017, similar to Management Training Corporation, also actually closed down, where 200 jobs were lost for that community because they weren't making enough money. And about 2 years later, they reopened as an immigrant detention center. And so I think when we're thinking about how do we push the governor, how do we push counties away from relying on these detention centers, is we have to make sure that we're making an argument that encompasses the lived realities of the individuals there, but also for our state. And so it's about economics. It's about how do we move our state away from the dependency on prisons for our economic well, for the economy of our state. And so, and I know that when I've spoken to some representatives, well, the representative from Cibola County, he was asking about what would he do if he loses the hundreds of jobs there, and he had that scare in 2016. Margaret and Avid worked on a bill two legislative sessions ago, and then there was another bill in the last session as well, trying to limit limit the expansion of immigrant beds or immigrant detention centers in our state, preventing any new contracts from being entered into, and also phasing out the current contracts that exist. And so we're going to try to do that, to push that bill again in the next legislative session. But I think it's going to take calls to our representatives, especially calls to our representatives from rural communities, from Cibola, from Torrance, and from Otero, because it's going to take real leadership from those individuals to move away from the economic models that they currently rely on. And so you know, if we're able to push and make sure that Otero County doesn't figure out a way to meet MTC's demands, then hopefully Otero County Processing Center could shut down in September. And I think that just requires all of us to be vigilant and making sure that we're watching, and they know that we're watching. These detention centers exist because of the counties. ICE contracts out with the county, and then the county subcontracts out with these private prisons. So even though the governor has said that she has no authority over these federal prisoners, we definitely do see that there is a role of the state, because the counties are the ones who hold the contracts for these facilities. The counties can and do play a role in making sure that these facilities are running properly, that there is COVID testing, and that populations are being protected. And they also, just like MTC, have the right to terminate these contracts if they choose so. So there's different multiple levels, I think, that we can really use to push the state and the counties to move away from these facilities.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know there are questions coming in to the chat in general and to me privately. I think that we are going to try to answer these in the form of email and send them out with the recording and the resources. If there are any urgent questions, I think that if there's anything that anybody needs to clarify about what we talked about today, let's go ahead and talk about those right now, and then the other questions will be answered in emails. Does anybody have things they would clarify, share?
I just want to mention the grave concern that we have over what has come across Susan's work and what's come across our work is that core civic guards actually pepper sprayed individuals at the Torrance facility in retaliation because those individuals were engaged in a hunger strike. And so we're trying to investigate what happened. We're learning more from individuals inside and working on a strategy to also get our congressmen, Congress people also involved, and also pursuing any type of litigation that's needed to be pursued, because that can't happen in our state. I mean, that can happen in any detention center, but it is particularly in our realm to act. And I think that, you know, if any of you are, I think all of you are going to be automatically signed into our email system, unless you don't want to. But I think it's important for us all to be vigilant, because we're going to need to put pressure on Torrance County and on the facility so that they know that we're not going to allow that in our state. So I think it's just really important for us to make sure to highlight that that is something that I haven't heard happen in one of these facilities. Of course, I haven't really been as involved before 2016, but still we need to make sure that we hold our local elected officials accountable, and we hold these facilities accountable.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, just a huge thank you to Margaret and Susan for not only what you shared with us today, but your work every day in these facilities. It is honestly, from what we hear from folks, more comforting from the work that we provide. So thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time and for giving us a little bit extra of your time. We will be in touch soon. I've seen some messages about continuing these video updates. And so I think that is something we would definitely be open to doing and would love to continue insofar as we cannot meet in person. Thank you all so much. You'll hear from us soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday evenings. Bye, everybody.